Hello, welcome. Welcome to EclipseCon. Great to be on the show and thanks for having me. I'm super glad to be here and talk to you about one topic that is very, very close to my heart. Usually, I would talk about Spring Tools since my name is Martin and I work for VMware on Spring Tools, and that's kind of very close to the Eclipse community, of course, all the developer tooling. But this time, the same as last year, I will talk about a totally different topic, which is about sustainability. And last year, I gave an intro about what I think is important around sustainability for software engineers. And this year, I'm super happy that I got the chance to talk about one specific topic in more detail, which is carbon offsetting. And in order to do that, I would like to share my screen, show some slides, and give you a quick tour about my thoughts, basically. So let me share my screen and do a little tour about carbon offsetting and sustainability in software engineering, what I think is important. So I think we all know that climate change is real and that we need to do something about it. The question is, what do different people do? And how can we do something about it? We all know that greenhouse gas emissions, that this is the main problem, right? That we emit a lot of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon emissions. Other greenhouse gases are involved as well, but the carbon emissions are really kind of the main driver of the climate change that we are facing and causing many, many problems that we have and that we will have. So we all know that we need to decarbonize everything, all across every single aspect. And we know we need to do that. The problem is, why is this so difficult? The reason I think why this is so difficult is, of course, we are so used to burning fossil fuels, basically, and using all these fossil energies to drive every aspect of our life. And if we think about that, we really need to decarbonize all the aspects. And that's what basically every company needs to do, every human being needs to do. Think about what are the carbon emissions that we cause, and we need to eliminate that completely. If you take a look at that from the software engineering perspective, and for me as a software engineer, there's not only the obvious ones that I may be aware of I'm consuming energy from the energy provider, and maybe I need to switch that to renewable energies and things like that. There are tons of other things involved, like heating and cooling, data center operation, hardware production, network data transfer. Even if I do business travel, right? I go to a conference maybe in person one day in the future again. How do I travel to that conference? What about the accommodation on site? It's everything is involved if we think about decarbonizing all the different aspects. So, and this is difficult. If we need to go into every single aspect and really decarbonize everything and get rid of all the carbon emissions in all the different aspects, it's really difficult and really hard to achieve. We still need to do that, but it's really hard to achieve. Interestingly, there are companies out there that claim that they are already carbon neutral. So the question is, how is that possible? How can a company say, oh, we are carbon neutral? So basically, what do they really mean with that? It's hard to believe that they decarbonized already everything, because that's almost impossible at the moment to already achieve that. It's very, very difficult. So how is it possible that you say, as a company or as an individual, maybe even, hey, I'm carbon neutral, or my company is carbon neutral? How does it work? The reason and the truth behind that is that most of those companies, they do carbon offsetting. And that is the main topic I would like to talk about and explain a little bit, what does that mean? And also share with you my insights about what I think maybe makes sense and maybe doesn't make sense. It sounds it sounds a little bit weird if you look at those companies who are claiming that they're carbon neutral. Even companies like Avis, kind of a car rental company, where the whole business model is based on cars with combustion engines burning fossil fuels all the time. Even they say they're carbon neutral by doing carbon offsetting. What does that mean? And how does carbon offsetting work? So the first step is, if you think about this carbon offsetting, is that you actually measure or calculate your carbon emissions. And you need to be very precise about that. And you can do that. You can do that as a kind of as an individual at home. There are calculators out there where you can get a relatively good measurement about your carbon emissions that you produce every year, every day, every week. And companies can do the same, basically. They can really calculate down what are their carbon emissions and walking through all those different aspects that are involved. It's not only consuming energy, it's also about the food production. It is about business travel. It is about the hardware that they buy, what is involved in building this hardware when I buy a new laptop, for example. And you can calculate all that, and more information is available for that. So, for example, if you go out there and buy a machine for data center, for example, you get a data sheet where it's exactly measured already for you. What are the carbon emissions involved in buying and producing this machine and using it, for example? So there are relatively good ways to actually calculate that. It is still not easy. It's nothing that you can just do, but it is possible. And if you take it seriously, you can walk into the details and actually do that. Maybe, probably, with a little help of external agencies or other companies who are specialized on that can help you actually measuring and evaluating your company and your business from the carbon emissions perspective. And you should actually do that to get an idea about where are you and where are we as maybe as a software community. Then once the company kind of measured and got an amount about, okay, we are producing so many tons of carbon emissions every year or every month or every week, then the second step is they buy carbon credits. So basically you go to a company and you buy carbon credits in the same amount of the emissions that you produced and put into the atmosphere, basically. These carbon credits, where do they come from, and what is such a carbon credit? The basic idea is that there are certified projects out there in the world across all the countries, all across the globe, basically. And those projects, they do something to have a positive impact on carbon emissions. And if they do that, they can get certified and can sell this positive impact that they have to the outside world, and that way, for example, getting money to fund themselves. So one example of that is, for example, the famous Cookstoves. So in developing countries, they use these modern cookstoves that produce a lot less carbon emissions when they are operated than their traditional way of cooking. And this is a very famous example because there are a lot of projects who are supporting these developing countries in that. So you pay money to those projects, they invest the money in those cookstoves, and therefore you help with this investment that less carbon emissions are being produced in the future because people use these a lot more, kind of factor, whatever, 10, 100, new cook stoves that produce less carbon emissions in the future. And the calculation is, of course, made in a way that the amount that you invest is kind of calculated based on your carbon emissions, so that this amount of carbon emissions is being saved from being produced, in this case, from being produced in the future. So that's one example. So those projects, they can sell these carbon credits and you can buy those carbon credits and therefore support those projects and help them to produce less carbon emissions in the future. What is the problem with this example from my point of view? First of all these projects that I'm going to talk about, I think are very good projects, right? It's really good to support those developing countries. It's very good. It's a very meaningful and valuable thing to support those projects and to help them use those kind of cookstoves in the future. No question about that. The same applies to all the other examples that I will showcase. They all share this common ground of it really makes sense to invest money into them and to support those projects. But does it really help to compensate or to offset your carbon emissions? So if you put an amount of X tons of carbon into the atmosphere today, that doesn't change only because you support this project. You help this project to produce less carbon emissions in the future so that not even more carbon emissions are being put into the atmosphere. That is great, but it doesn't really solve the problem of you putting the carbon emissions in. That's one aspect. And the other aspect of especially these projects are these cookstoves and investing in projects in developing countries is that the industrialized countries produce a lot of carbon emissions, right? The per individual amount of carbon emissions that we, for example, in Europe produce or in the US produce is by a factor of 10 or 100 times higher than the carbon emissions that are at the moment being produced in those other countries that you support with these projects. Wouldn't it make more sense to try to avoid carbon emissions here where we produce so much of them? I think that will probably make more sense. What is another example? Another example of projects that those companies who kind of support carbon offsetting support and fund are renewable energy productions, which of course, again, is just perfect, right? Perfect thing. You should do it. We need to get up to 100% renewable energy production. No question about that. And supporting that and funding that makes a lot of sense. But there's also kind of the flip side of the coin here, because if you support these renewable energy projects, it makes a lot of sense, but it does not necessarily mean that carbon emissions are being reduced in the future, which sounds a bit weird. But at the moment, or in many countries, not in all countries, but, or maybe, I'm not sure if there's many, but a lot of countries have a so-called cap and trade system. So you have a fixed amount of carbon emissions that the country, for example, is allowed to put into the atmosphere that the government decided on, and they sell certificates for that, so that companies who would like to put carbon emissions into the atmosphere need to buy certificates to do that. So, for example, if there's kind of a burning fossil fuels, burning coal or whatever, you need to buy those certificates to be allowed to put it into the atmosphere. If there's more renewable energy being produced, that is great, but it does not reduce the amount of total carbon emissions that are being allowed to put into the atmosphere in these cap and trade systems, for example, that we have in Germany or in Europe, in parts of the US as well, and other countries as well. So that does not necessarily lead to reducing carbon emissions. It is still a good investment, right? And it still makes sense because we need to power everything with renewable energy, no question about that. But it does not necessarily mean that the carbon emissions that you are trying to offset, that you put into the atmosphere, are being really compensated, are being extracted out of the atmosphere, or being saved in the future by not being put into the atmosphere, really. So that's kind of the flip side of these investing in renewable energy problems to offset your carbon emissions. So what is the next example? The next, I think, very famous example is planting trees. There are many projects who actually plant trees, and this is despite any research that's being done to kind of invent some great technology to extract carbon from the atmosphere, planting trees is actually a very efficient way of doing it. A very natural, of course, but also a very efficient way of doing it. And you can support those projects, right? They plant trees. And you can calculate actually pretty exactly how much carbon are those trees extracting from the atmosphere. So this is one step further towards actually really trying to extract the carbon emissions that you put into the atmosphere, your company put into the atmosphere, that you emitted, to really extract them back into trees, out of the atmosphere, which makes a lot of sense, right? So again, as all the other projects, this also makes a lot of sense and is probably the example that comes very close to actually trying to eliminate those emissions again that you put into the atmosphere. What is the flip side of that? The flip side of that is, or the difficulty of that is, that planting trees is usually the calculation behind that. It takes a long time. So the calculation of most of the projects is between, they assume that the tree that you plant for you invest money, you emit carbon into the atmosphere, you calculate that, there's an amount of money being calculated from that, you invest that into plant a tree. This tree needs between 40 and 100 years until it really extracted this amount of carbon from the atmosphere. So it takes a long time. And at the same time, you assume that this tree will live for 40 to 100 years. It's not burning down, it's not being used for industry or whatever. So that you really plan that in a country or in an area where it can actually live, and it's guaranteed to live for 40 to 100 years. But going back to the original idea of why should I do this? I emitted carbon into the atmosphere. I would like to kind of compensate for that. So I would like to I wasn't able to really avoid that. So I would like to get it out of the atmosphere again. Planting trees, great idea, but it takes a long time. So if we think about, we need to decarbonize everything most likely within the next 10 years, something like that. I'm not sure if it makes a lot of sense to say I plant a tree and that will take 40 to 100 years to actually extract that again. So it's really stretching that out on a very, very, very large timeline. So again, makes a lot of sense to do that, but you need to think about the calculation and think about, does it really make sense to plant these many trees? Or should I maybe think about planting probably 10 times as many trees? So should I maybe increase my offsetting amount by a factor of 10 to really make an impact in a shorter period of time instead of the next 40 to 100 years? So what are the additional options that we have on the table for doing these offsetting and for making an impact, actually? And the additional offset, and I already talked about this cap and trade system a little bit, is to remove these carbon certificates from these cap and trade systems. You cannot really do that as an individual, but you can do that as a company, for example. So you buy those carbon certificates so that no one else is allowed to use that. So if the government says, okay, the country is allowed to, or everybody in the company, or everybody in the country, all the companies are allowed to emit this amount of carbon emissions in this year, and you buy those certificates, actually, at the bottom line, you cause less carbon emissions to be allowed to be produced. So which is an interesting effect. So you kind of basically use these cap and trade system to actually remove the allowed amount of carbon that is being produced in the system. So you can just do that as well, maybe in combination. So this is what these cap and trade systems, what this system is all about. So to give you a summary, I think what is very important is that carbon offsetting doesn't solve the problem, right? You cannot just sit back, relax, and say, "Oh yeah, I pay for this offsetting. I do this, let's say, this greenwashing, and I don't care about my emissions anymore, and I don't care how many emissions I produce." Carbon offsetting doesn't solve that, right? Carbon offsetting is really just a last resort to do stuff in addition to eliminate your emissions. And if you cannot, by all means, eliminate your emissions right away by tomorrow, you should at least think about offsetting them. But that's not the end goal. That's just on the way to eliminate all the emissions and actually help the system to eliminate carbon from the atmosphere. So that is, I think, a very, very important point, because carbon offsetting is very, very often criticized of being this greenwashing thing, and that is true if people use it in a way that they don't care about their emissions anymore. They just put a sticker on the website saying, "Hey, we are carbon neutral. Everything is so awesome. We took care about everything." No, that's not the goal, right? The goal is use offsetting for the stuff that you cannot eliminate at the moment, but you need to work on this elimination, not on the offsetting. And if you do offsetting for this remaining thing, which is per se a good thing, right? You need to invest your money very wisely, I think. So for me personally, I would prefer planting trees is a great idea because it actually removes stuff from the atmosphere. And there are organizations that support planting trees in areas where you live, basically, or where we live. So in Europe or in the US or wherever you live, right? But maybe I would like to encourage you to think about the amount, and that in the end, it really makes sense to invest more into planting those trees than just the amount that you get calculated from these calculators, because that is, most of the stuff is based on these 40 to 100 years. And I think we need to be better at that. So we should invest more, and then it gets more expensive. So carbon offsetting is quite cheap at the moment. If you look at that, it's not that much, but it feels wrong that it is so cheap. So I think the price tag on the carbon emissions should be a lot higher, and you can do that basically on your own if you just change the amount that you invest for planting trees, maybe by a factor of 10 or by a factor of 5 or whatever you prefer, right? Up to you. And in addition to that, and that's, I think, what for example, and that's just one example, For Tomorrow is doing. They do these from both sides, right? They invest in planting trees, and they invest in removing those carbon certificates from these cap and trade systems, so that the real amount of carbon that is allowed to be produced in the economy is effectively really being reduced by removing these certificates from the system, which I think is a very, very interesting and promising approach. So please think about that. I think that is important, but don't sit back and don't think that carbon offsetting solves all our climate problems. It's really just the last resort. And I hope I was able to give you a brief insight about how things are working behind the scenes, and what you can and maybe should think about when you choose when to offset and how to offset. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening. And I will stop sharing my screen in a second and would be super happy to answer a few questions if you have a few. So please, 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 please submit your questions in the chat that I will be able to see in a second, and give feedback to the talk, and would be more than happy to hear from you. hope you like it. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And now I'm happy to answer questions. So let me stop sharing my screen and go back to my chat window so that I can take a look at that. Okay, questions. What do you think about carbon capturing systems like the one from Iceland? Do you think it will be a viable solution if it gets efficient enough? Good question. The stuff that I've seen so far, and I'm not in every detail of these systems, but from what I've seen and what I've learned about it is that scaling them up to an amount that we would need to actually make a difference is very, very difficult and very challenging. So maybe they can play part of the puzzle, but I don't think that will be the solution. And we can just sit back and say, research and engineering will solve the problem for us by doing these systems. Maybe they can play a part, but I don't think it will be the solution to the problem, at least not from what I've seen so far, because scaling them up to this amount that is really needed is almost impossible at the moment. Okay, hope that answers the question. There was another question, what about removing carbon out of the air using a machine? So that's kind of the related question. So next question, the governments could reduce the amount of carbon certificates. Would it not be easier to pressure the government in lowering the amount of carbon certificates? Yes, it would be. Yes. We should do that, of course. Yeah. The lower these allowed carbon emissions, the better, of course. No question about that. But independent of what the government is doing and whatever the exact limit it will be, you could still go and use the system and extract those even more certificates from the system if you think the government is not doing enough. Of course, you should pressure the government to reduce that amount. No question about that. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a related question. When certificates are taken from the market by buying, might this lead later just that more certificates are emitted? So that's kind of, if the question goes into the direction of if the government is actually kind of thinking about, now we need to emit more certificates. Who knows what will happen in the future? I think you can influence that by voting in the democracy for your political leaders that you think you want to have, that are actually making those decisions. And I think that's the influence that we can have on that side. So making your cross in voting wherever you think it makes sense. So I think we have 2 more minutes. Can I do carbon offsetting in my private life as well? Yes, you can. You cannot buy those certificates and remove them from the system, these cap and trade certificates. That is difficult. But you can support, or you can, for example, use an agency like For Tomorrow, or it's kind of basically a small company, and give them the money, kind of buy these. They have plans, carbon offsetting plans for individuals, basically, and they plant trees and reduce those certificates from the system, for example. And there are many calculators out there where you can estimate your own carbon emissions that you produce in your private life. So that's certainly possible. Okay, more questions. Congratulations for VMware achieving carbon neutrality. How was it achieved? Yes, VMware, so you can download a huge report from VMware about their activities in protecting the climate and achieving carbon neutrality and so on. So what they actually did is they went ahead and moved, I think, almost everything to renewable energies. So everything that's being powered at VMware is being powered by renewable energies. So they're buying renewable energy from the market in the same amount of power that they use. And of course, they also do carbon offsetting. I think mostly for projects, I think in the US, with partners, to offset stuff that they cannot eliminate at the moment. But I think the goal is to be net zero very soon. Okay, so I hope I was able to answer a few questions. And thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.